Missile strikes on energy infrastructure, disruption to global shipping routes, and rising oil and gas prices. This is the reality of the conflict unfolding in the Gulf, 3 weeks after the United States and Israel started carrying out strikes on Iran. As we speak, Qatar has reported extensive further damage following Iranian missile attacks near the Ras Laffan terminal, the world's largest liquefied natural gas facility. The consequences are already being felt well beyond the region. Energy prices are rising, global markets are reacting, and key supply chains, from shipping to aviation, are increasingly under pressure. What we're witnessing is not longer just a military confrontation. It is a conflict that is beginning to impact the global economy, and that could have far-reaching implications for stability in the Middle East and beyond. Welcome to Med Insights, the Med Dialogues podcast by ISPI, where we unpack the forces shaping the Middle East and North Africa and what they mean for global politics. I am Nicola Missaglia, Curator of the Med Dialogues and Head of Communications at ISPI. Today, we try to make sense of this rapidly evolving crisis. What are the strategic objectives behind this escalation? What scenarios lie ahead? And what does this war mean for the region and for the global order?
Dangerous phase in US-Iran tensions.
Israel had said it would reopen Gaza's southern Rafah crossing with Egypt.
To help us unpack these questions, I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Vali Nasr, professor at Johns Hopkins University and one of the leading experts on Iran and US foreign policy. Thank you very much for being with us. In the first days of the US-Israel campaign, there was a widespread sense, especially in Washington, that this would be a short and decisive operation. Instead, Iran has shown a much stronger and more sustained response, and the conflict is now spreading across the region. Do you think the US and Israel fundamentally misread Iran's resilience and perhaps the very nature of this war?
So I think Israel from the beginning expected a long war because its goal was to bring down the Islamic Republic and destroy its military capability, especially missiles and the entire military industrial complex that allows it to build missiles. I think President Trump thought the war would or could be much, much shorter, maybe 3 to 4 days, that you decapitate the regime and somehow you're going to end up in a Venezuela scenario. So President Trump definitely completely misjudged the situation. Not only the regime didn't fall, there is no sign that it's actually even cracking to produce a faction that would want to talk to him. And then he said publicly that he was surprised that Iran chose to attack Arab countries in the Persian Gulf. And I think both Israel and the United States have been surprised by Iran's resilience, by the way in which decapitation, killing of leaders, has not, A, made the regime fall or break apart, and B, it has not denied it the ability to fight back. And secondly, I do think they were surprised by the fact that Iran has been able to wage a war against US and Israel in a way that it has absorbed their attacks, but then by attacking back, it has also depleted a lot of Israel and the US's interceptor capabilities to defend against drones and missiles. So we're now in the third week of the war, and Iran is still sending very devastating missiles into Israel, which are actually landing at a damaging rate to the country. And secondly, I think they were surprised by Iran's ability and willingness to start a war on the global economy. In other words, use the global economy as a battlefront, and to do so very successfully. So I would say 3 weeks into the war, it's very clear that the assumptions and the strategy of Israel and the United States have not worked. Whereas Iran is implementing the strategy that it had devised before the war, based on what they learned in the June war, fairly successfully. I'm not saying they're winning, but they're obviously are in the fight. They're prolonging the fight, and they're gradually building leverage against the United States and Israel.
So this is clearly an existential war for the Iranian regime. And in recent analysis, you have argued that Iran is not just responding militarily, but is actually pursuing a much broader strategy. Can you walk us through what this strategy looks in practice and what Tehran is ultimately trying to achieve?
Well, Iran understood that it cannot fight the United States and Israel, in terms that they want to fight Iran. In other words, Iran does not have air defenses that can protect against far more advanced air forces and missile capabilities, and that Israel and the United States have a very deep capacity for offensive attack against Iran. So Iran should prepare itself for a way that it would not collapse under that pressure. And then it has to prolong the war, because the longer the war goes on, the more the offensive attack becomes less decisive. I mean, once you kill the supreme leader, nothing happens. Once you hit these targets, nothing happens. Then you eventually have to go after civilian targets. Infrastructure, gas, oil, electricity, hospitals, etc., which only turns the Iranian public against U.S. and Israel, against the war. And if U.S. and Israel were hoping that the population would rise up, they're not going to do that when increasingly it's clear that there is no opportunity to do it, and also the war is on the country. Secondly, a longer war means that U.S. and Israel would begin to use more and more of their interceptors to deal with Iranian drones and missiles. And I think Iran's calculation was that maybe some 10, 15 days into the war, they begin to run low. So then that gives Iran more strategic advantage. In other words, it now is not about Israeli bombs or American bombs. It's about a race between destroying Iran's launchers and missile silos versus interceptors. So it's become a much more even competition. Which one's going to be depleted first, Iran's missile or Israeli interceptors? Secondly, waging a war on the global economy by definition has to be a long war. In other words, you begin to put pressure on oil prices by trying to close the Straits of Hormuz. And then you have the capacity to say, well, if you hit my oil or gas, like Israel did by hitting Iran's South Pars field gas, we'll also hit, likewise, gas fields in Qatar. You hit our oil fields, or you attack the Kharg Island, where we export most of our oil from, we'll hit oil installations across the Gulf. And in the first 10 days, the Gulf and the United States have already depleted their ability, their interceptors to deal with Iranian missiles and drones. So Iran used a lot of drones to get that depletion. Now, essentially, all of these infrastructure are vulnerable to Iran. And that is pushing the price of oil higher. And it's not just oil. The Straits of Hormuz is a passageway to container ships that carry varieties of things around the world. Particularly from across the global south to Europe, etc., from fertilizers for agriculture to cooking oil for Indian stoves to varieties of things. So the longer the war goes, the more there is pressure on U.S. economy in the form of inflation and shortages. There will be pressure on European economies in the form of inflation and shortages, and then there could be a case of a global recession if varieties of countries begin to have problems with supply chain. So that the global economy, therefore, becomes the major pressure on the United States to stop fighting and to agree to an end game. So that's why it doesn't serve Iran to have a short war. Iran is like a weak boxer, a smaller boxer, facing in a boxing match where the other side thinks it can knock it out in the first round or two. And in fact, it needs to do that. So what Iran believed is that it has to have a stamina and a strategy to take this boxing match to the 15th round, believing the other side is very powerful, but really doesn't have the stamina to go into a long game. So the more rounds you go, the weaker the other side's hand becomes. Now, this may not work. At some point, Iran may collapse before that. But for now, the strategy has been able to prolong the war into 20 days. And we just saw that after attacking Qatar's gas fields, it's President Trump who's backed off, issuing a tweet saying that was a mistake and Israel will not do it again. Right? And the Iranian, I think this was all evident. It's a bit of a surprise that it has taken the United States and Israel unawares that Iran would do exactly this.
Then, of course, the question becomes whether military escalation alone can really deliver the objectives that Washington and Tel Aviv have in mind.
So I think, you have to go to the beginning. The president really didn't think he needs to have an objective. He didn't to explain an objective. The State of the Union happened a few days before the war went on. And although he gave a very, very long speech, he spent no more than a couple of minutes on Iran. And none of that was actually directed at providing a clear explanation about why war was necessary and what was the objective of the war. And then we've seen the objective of the war after the war started, that the objective of the war had to be laid out. So it was either because Iran was almost getting a nuclear weapon, or Iran's ballistic missiles were going to reach the United States, or that it was payback for 47 years of Iranian misbehavior. So they began, or that the objective was regime change. So they kept moving around. And none of them really explained why the United States went into this war. And as I mentioned, the war was based on the false assumption that Iran would collapse very quickly and that the war would not spread to the global economy and to the rest of the region. Now that it has, the U.S. really does not have an alternative other than going to the table. So the only thing it can do, and Israel is doing, is to keep doing what they were doing on day one, which is hit Iran, kill more of its leaders, under the assumption that by just doing it more, eventually they're going to get their way, right? So maybe they just need to escalate the number of killings, the number of bombings. And in fact, the hitting of Iran's gas fields was one such escalation. But it showed that it actually not only is not working, it can be counterproductive. And so, yes, there could always be a surprise that tomorrow morning the Iranian regime falls. But if it doesn't, I think increasingly the president is under pressure to either contemplate a very significant escalation, meaning begin to really think about not just using bigger bombs, but ultimately that he might need to invade Iran, which is something that would take maybe a couple of years of preparation and implementation, which the global economy cannot tolerate. Or that he has to now come with a strategy of negotiations. And I don't think he has thought about that. In other words, how does he go to the table with Iran and end this war without accepting an outcome that is much less than what he thought was going to happen when he invaded Iran? And that, I think, to me, is the strategic victory of Iran. In other words, Iran has survived long enough to force the president now into having to choose between options that he didn't think he had to. And both of them are going to be extremely difficult options for the United States.
President Trump and the US administration have sent somewhat mixed signals, both on the timeline of the conflict and on its ultimate objectives. From your perspective, what is the actual US endgame here, and what is Washington really trying to achieve today?
So my reading of it is that this war started when the relations between the Iranian public and their government and the Islamic Republic was at its worst ever. In other words, in January 2026, there was a massive uprising in Iran demanding an end to the Islamic Republic. The Islamic Republic suppressed that uprising very bloodily by killing thousands of Iranians. And that essentially consolidated the population in Iran, the large majority of the population around anti-regime feelings that the Islamic Republic must go. And the Islamic Republic, by and large, lost its legitimacy in many ways among overwhelming majority of Iranians. So maybe that also led Israel and the United States to expect that when war starts, that there's going to be a popular uprising. And Israel still keeps saying that we're killing people in order to pave the way. But I give you an example. In order to kill Iran's Minister of Intelligence 2 days ago, Israel killed 50 people in that street to kill one person. So what the Iranian people, in the very first night when Khamenei was killed, even though nobody came out to demonstrate, may have thought that this might be a war of liberation. Maybe the Islamic Republic will fall. Maybe there's a silver lining to this war, that you tolerate your country being attacked, its leadership being killed, but then quickly a better day is coming forward. But the longer the war is going, what they see is that the war, first of all, is not causing the regime to fall. B, that it is replacing all the leaders that are being killed are being replaced by worse leaders, more hardline leaders, more aggressive leaders. That the Islamic Republic is actually becoming more radical and hardline. And also that the war is no longer being waged against the regime. The war is being waged against them. It's Tehran that's being damaged. It's historical sites in Isfahan that is being damaged. So when you hit the gas field and petrochemicals in Iran, or you hit an oil depot that causes acid rain to fall on Tehran, that these actually damage people. So if Iran loses its ability to produce and distribute gas, electricity will go out, cooking gas will not be available, varieties of industrial things in Iran would collapse. And so this issue of are you for the regime or against the regime is no longer the only question in Iran. The question is also, are you for the war or against the war? And is the country under attack or is the regime under attack? And so you have overlaying, intersecting set of feelings in Iran. But the Iranian public as a whole is highly traumatized. It was traumatized by the June war. It was traumatized by what happened in January, by the bloodletting in January, and it's traumatized by the war right now. And I don't see the Iranian public right now organized enough or unified enough around a single message to rise up. Yes, there's a segment who might say the war is still justified if it gets rid of the Islamic Republic. But there's also a segment that says, as bad as the Islamic Republic is, my priority is to survive the bombs that is falling on my head and also protect the country from becoming destroyed in this war. And so I see the Iranian public as a victim of this war, that Israel and the United States have not improved their lives. And in fact, have created a situation that the unified anti-government feeling that had gelled around the massacres in January has now become confused and diluted by the much larger reality of a devastating war on Iran.
And how is Iranian society actually reacting to this war?
So there are two things can happen. One is that you end up with a version of Libya and Syria in Iran. In other words, civil war, civil chaos, instability, which is maybe fine for Israel because it doesn't share a border with Iran, but it could be a long-term headache for Iraq, for Turkey, for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and for the Persian Gulf monarchies. As a country of 92 million, descending into chaos is going to be hugely destabilizing for the Middle East. The other alternative is that a different version or a different leadership out of the Islamic Republic will take over. There is no political movement, organized political movement outside of the Islamic Republic right now in Iran. Yes, there's plenty of anger at the government. There is support for some exile leaders. There are civil society and political leaders in prison in Iran, but none of them. But that doesn't mean there is a political movement. That there is organization across the country. That there is something there that can step into the void and govern Iran. That doesn't exist. And the only way in which the West could either have an exile leader or a government of its liking is actually to have tanks in Tehran, like they did in Baghdad or in Kabul. So a collapse of the Islamic Republic in this way, it could either mean a fracturing of the Islamic Republic, and we don't know what faction would emerge that can actually govern Iran, or we're going to end up with a collapse of the state in Iran, which then is a more similar scenario to Libya and to Syria, and then that might take a long time before we know what direction comes out of that.
So for the time being, if the regime does not collapse, which it doesn't seem right now, we should expect a more hardline and securitized Iran going forward. Now, looking ahead, what are the most likely scenarios for how this conflict evolves, especially considering Iran's strategy and the growing economic pressure globally? Do you see a pathway to a durable settlement, or are we heading towards a prolonged phase of instability both regionally and globally?
I don't see any diplomatic movement right now. I mean, Iran keeps saying what it wants, which is it doesn't want a ceasefire. It wants an end to the war. End to the war, they say, means end to the war in Yemen, Lebanon, something really big that they want. They also want guarantees of not being attacked again. Now, the United States and Israel are not at the point where they're willing to even think about that. Iran also wants a drastic change to its economic portfolio, that the chokehold that has been pulled on its economy by maximum pressure sanctions would be lifted. Now, they put it in the language that we want war compensation for damage done to Iran. Or now they have come with an idea that Iran will in the future demand tolls for ships crossing the Straits of Hormuz, much like the Suez Canal. But what they're basically saying that the end of this war has to be beneficial to Iran, right? We're not at a point that we're just willing to stop. The United States, on the other hand, President Trump cannot accept this because that would be a clear defeat for him. He's willing to accept a ceasefire, namely say, oh, well, I got what I wanted. Now let's just stop fighting, or I'm going to declare victory and move away. But the Iranians won't accept that, and perhaps Israelis won't accept that because they also haven't finished what they started. So I think that all sides are going to continue fighting in the hope that either there's sudden break in their direction, or that they can build enough leverage to bring the other side to the table. But the way it's going right now, it's Iran that is actually building leverage, because it went from zero leverage to having quite a good deal of leverage. Now, U.S. still has leverage, but it's not able to use that leverage in a way that ends this conflict as a very clear victory for the U.S.
So let's come to my final question. Do you think this war could reshape the Middle East, and how will it impact the perception of the United States in the region?
Well, it all depends on how this war ends. I mean, if it ends with the collapse of Iran and a victory for U.S. and the United States, then we have to think about what does the collapse of Iran mean for the Middle East. And also, out of this war, you would have a very clear victor called Israel at the regional level. And then what does a decisive Israeli victory in this war mean for the region? If Iran survives the war and is actually able to get some of what it's asking for, then basically the sort of Israeli-American project for reshaping the Middle East would have failed. And we will be, and then also even the Persian Gulf monarchies will begin to rethink the security environment in which they had existed. Turkey will begin to rethink. And so then you're in a period of thinking, what does a new balance of power in the region mean? But I think the United States, if it doesn't get its way in this war, essentially its moment in the Middle East could be very well over, which is that it's unable to protect the Gulf countries. It had started a war that it cannot finish. It has brought a great deal of damage to the country, to the region, and also its reputation around the world would be damaged in many ways. And so I think the broader costs to the United States are quite high.
Professor, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us today. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in to this episode of Med Insights. As this conflict continues to evolve, its consequences will likely extend far beyond the battlefield, reshaping not only the Middle East, but also global economic and political dynamics in ways that are still difficult to fully anticipate. We will continue to follow these developments closely. Editorial support and production by Sara Isabella Leikin, Luca Puzzangara, and Eleonora Marciani. If you enjoyed this episode, follow the Med Insights podcast on all major platforms. For more analysis and updates, visit med.ispionline.it. Thank you for listening.